And we start with our slot number 6, I believe, exactly 6. Let's go for it, this time with Noemi Michel and Christian Pierce. I give the word to you. Go for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio, and good afternoon, everyone. For those who might not be watching in Central European time or outside of Switzerland, good morning or even good evening. I am excited and elated to get started with this afternoon session. So the 6th annual St. Gallen Diversity and Inclusion Week has been really talking about including and excluding, the impact of invisibility. And when we talk about the issues here in Switzerland, especially fighting racism and ethnic discrimination, there is a huge exclusion issue that we have to discuss. And so with that said, we have Dr. Noemi Michel with us today. I will get into a bit more later on about her, but as you can see, this is the D&I Week program. We are currently in the middle, the 3rd session of the 3rd day. So tomorrow, we've got wage transparency and then intelligence and D&I and the impact of intelligence. So those are still online. And then Friday, if you are in Switzerland, I highly encourage you to come visit us at St. Gallen. You can meet up and network in person, but also have some impactful workshops in order to understand not just awareness, but take away action in order to create a more equitable society. Now, with that said, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Dr. Noemi Michel is an anti-racist and feminist scholar. She's a teacher, activist, and cultural worker. She is a lecturer in political theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Geneva and teaches regularly at the Geneva School of Art and Design. Dr. Michel has been a visiting professor on diversity politics at HU University and has completed research stays at Northwestern University, UC Berkeley out in Cali, and ESS in Paris. She's currently researching different understandings of anti-racism in public debates in institutions in Europe, as well as diasporic Black feminist theories of political voice. Now, if today is your first time hearing of Dr. Michel or getting to hear her speak, I highly encourage you after this talk, go read one of her papers, or not just one, many of them, especially Sheepology. Sheepology was, when I moved to Switzerland, the paper that helped form the foundation on my anti-racist information and fight here. So Sheepology, the post-colonial politics of raceless racism in Switzerland. Give that a read. That is a mandatory, obligatory on your read list. With that said, I'm gonna stop talking and transition to Dr. Michel. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing your powerful and impactful words. One last thing before that, I'm too excited to get into it. A special thanks to all of our wonderful sponsors who've supported us throughout this week. We appreciate everything that you and your organizations are doing to make Switzerland and the world a more equitable place. Thank you very much. And with that said, please, the floor is yours, Dr. Michel.
Thank you so much, Christian. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. First of all, I want to thank Christian for the initial invitation and also the generous invitation. It's always nice to hear that some of my writings have impact and are useful for people. So thank you for that. I also want to thank your colleagues, especially Julio and Nina, for the organizational work. And before diving into the topics, I will begin with 2 preliminary remarks. As you can see, the title of my talk is Understanding Racial Burden and Tokenism. But I think when I initially responded to Christian some months ago with that title, I was, as usually, a little bit too ambitious. So the talk today will focus on only one concept. So you have 2 concepts, tokenism and racial burden. And the talk today will really focus on understanding, deciphering what we mean by tokenism, and more specifically by tokenizing. But I will I will come to the second concept, racial burden, at the very end of the presentation, and I hope that we can discuss that also during the Q&A. The second preliminary remark that I would like to do is that this talk is based on an ongoing participatory, collective, and experimental research. I work more and more in the field of the arts, so I have changed my way of my methodologies is less classical than before. And so this research, it focuses on Black women in various institutional settings. And I will share in this specific talk a story that is based on several experiences told to me by my close circle of Black women who work in higher education. So I emphasize this because I really want to make you aware that what I'm presenting like as a single author, but is really rooted in collective knowledge and also in politics of care. So I would also like to ask you to receive this material accordingly, with respect, care, and caution. If you want to refer to this material, please just reach out before, ask me. And last but not least, if you are a person of color, a Black person working in higher education, and you can relate to the story that I will tell, please reach out to me, and because I would gladly make you participate in that experimental research if you are interested in. All right, so these were the preliminary remark, and let's dive into the subject. I want to begin with the title of the Diversity and Inclusion Week in St. Gallen. Including, excluding the impact of invisibility or visibility. I like this title. It resonates with me because it goes against a commonsensical idea according to which achieving inclusion requires always visibility, or what is often called a politics of presence. The idea that a heightened presence of minoritized subjects will lead to a pluralization of issues and epistemologies, and thus to a more diverse and equal academia. So this is a very common idea. But the title of your week, by contrast, implies that maybe certain forms of visibility might produce exclusion. This goes against our intuition, right? And also that maybe certain forms of invisibility might foster inclusion. And in this talk, I want to contribute to this understanding of this week, of this exploration of the links between visibility and what I will call a form of unsustainable inclusion. And to do so, I will focus on tokenism, on the notion of tokenism, which is, I will give a very simple first preliminary definition, and then the whole talk will be about defining tokenism. So in the online Oxford Dictionary, tokenism is defined as, I quote, the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of sexual or racial equality within a workforce. So tokenism refers to institutional image management, to processes or to forms of visibility that actually successfully mask power dynamics and thus prevent contestation and change within various institutions. Tokenism implies a form of visibility that is hindering real inclusion. But how does that happen? What are the historical roots of tokenism? What are the mechanisms, the practices, the situations and affects, emotions that transform people into tokens? In order to address these questions, I want to develop a critique of tokenism by drawing upon a Black feminist framework. So let me offer a brief definition of what I mean by a Black feminist critique or Black feminist framework. First, a Black feminist critique refers here to my engagement with Black feminist thought that I identify as a specific and very important tradition of political thinking, which remains marginalized within the political theory canon. I engage with French, German, English, and English-speaking Black diasporic interventions that are political, artistic, and intellectual, and all concerned with social justice, equality, and liberation. And you can see here some covers of the books that I will quote in this talk today. And you can see that there are several languages that they actually cover both sides of the Atlantics. Yeah, so these are examples of the sources, the Black feminist voices I work with. A second important dimension of Black feminist critique is that it points towards a specific epistemology, a specific mode of theorizing that is produced through close readings of Black feminist voices, through an emphasis on subjectivity and lived experience, and finally through historical analysis. And third, Black feminist theorization means deploying an analytic of power that pays attention to the intersectional and dynamic working of race, gender, and capitalist modes of production and reproduction. In this regard, I will use the term operation, since this term points towards a temporal understanding of power. It refers to the constant production and reproduction of regimes, relations, technologies, discourses, and practices that come to stabilize power asymmetries and structures. In that context, I will privilege the term tokenizing over the term tokenism, and I will apprehend tokenizing as a set of operations that sustain unequal power relations. And lastly, my talk will focus on the voices and experiences of Black women in higher education. And it is important to note that the term woman in Black feminism includes the social positions, the modes of existing and embodiment of trans and non-binary subjects. All right. So how does Black feminism allow us to make sense of tokenizing within higher education? I want to start this Black feminist critique of tokenizing by situating tokenizing within a broader problem space that I will call the politics of embodied voice. A voice is at the center. So I will propose to think about tokenizing both as a politics of voice. It has to do with voice, but also as a politics of the body. It has to do with the body. Let me start with voice. Voice is at the center of Black feminists' concerns, as it can be translated here by this powerful quote by Grada Kilomba, she's asking about who has voice and who has no voice in academia. And I quote her, "What knowledge is being acknowledged as such, and what knowledge is not? What knowledge has been made part of academic agendas, and what knowledge has not? Whose knowledge is this? Who is acknowledged to have the knowledge, and who is not? Who can teach knowledge, and who cannot? Who is at the center, and who remains outside at the margins?" So following here, Grada Kilomba, we can apprehend academia as a community of voices, namely as an institution that is oriented towards the production and reproduction, the orchestration, and the cultivation of oral and written, individual and collective voices of knowledge. But in order to make sense of the politics of voice, we have to understand that voice is not something that we have. So it's not about who has voice, but it's something that is mediated. And here I rely on feminist and critical theories that are concerned with inclusion and power. that really put emphasis on the fact that voice is always mediated. For instance, I'm speaking to you right now, and you hear me, but it's not a direct consequence. My voice has been mediated through the Zoom dispositive, through the framing of the Diversity and Inclusion Week, through the way you receive my voice, like what makes sense to you. So there are a set of processes of mediation that make you hear me and listen to me. But it's also possible that processes of mediation, relations of power interact between my voice and your ears, and that my voice becomes only noise, that you actually are not able to really receive my voice. And this is what a feminist thinker called Aletta Norval calls the possibility of the deprivation of voice. So tokenizing in this perspective consists of a specific form of mediation between subjects of knowledge and their voice. So understanding tokenizing as a politics of voice means that we have to name the processes that lead to the lessening, the silencing, or the inferiorizing of certain voices in the context of higher education. And such processes, under a Black feminist lens, must be understood always as also embodied processes, hence the politic of embodied voice. Embodied processes that we can define as processes that lead to the differentiation and the hierarchization of bodies, processes that invest visible markers on our bodies, like our hair, the color of our skin, the shape of our nose, and so on and so forth. And those processes invest markers on our bodies in order to classify us and differentiate us. So Black feminists propose us to actually understand that our voices are also always embodied. You receive my voice and you also see my body. So you receive my voice as embodied, that's coming from a specific body that is racialized and gendered in a specific way. The politics of voice is always a politics of body. This means that one cannot make sense of tokenizing without giving flesh to higher education or to academia, namely without paying attention to the past and present bodily life of communities of voices that constitute our institutions of knowledge. So I propose to understand tokenizing as a specific instantiation of the politics of voice, as a specific mode of the politics of voice. And the argument that I will elaborate in what follows is that tokenizing, understood as a politics of voice, is experienced as unsustainable and burdening if we take the perspective of those whose bodies and voices are made tokens. And I will develop this argument in 3 steps. The first step is actually a story of tokenizing. Let me just, okay. Yeah. Let's title this story The Black Woman on the Poster. It is an account on the first person that is based on 2 sources. As I said, as a preliminary remark, I have been gathering accounts, including my own, in my circle of Black women and women of color who work in higher education institutions in Switzerland and Western Europe. So that's one source. And the other source is actually this book, To Exist is to Resist, which is a recently edited volume by Akugo Emejulu and Francesca Zobande. To Exist is to Resist, Black Feminism in Europe, which comprises a section by Black women in universities. So based on these 2 sources, I will tell a condensed story through the voice of V, who is a Black woman in her 30s, affiliated to an institute of social sciences in Western Europe, where she's not only one of the only academics of color, but also one of the only person researching about the intersections of race and gender. And I will tell this story in 4 episodes. So in the first episodes, V's V recalls how she was asked by her colleague to represent her subdiscipline in a promotional clip of a bachelor at her institute. I remind my colleague that there are other professors for my subdiscipline that could take part to the film. My colleague specifies that the director really insisted upon me. I end up figuring in the film. I am actually very present in that film. It begins with me and ends with me, smiling and explaining how wonderful my institution is. In the second episode, V goes back years earlier when she was a student and was casted for a poster campaign promoting her university's students' services. My image in the poster means that the university is also serving this kind of students. Indeed, I'm the only woman of color retained for the campaign. During many years that follow, at the beginning of each semester, I enter the main building of the university and cross a giant picture of me smiling, besides a text promoting the wonderful services of the university. On another poster, I walk with confidence besides 3 other students, all whites. We look at the sky and smile. For years, people recognize me in the streets or in parties and interpolate me as the woman on the university poster. In the third episode, V is shortlisted for a professorship at her institute. The job told goes well, but she does not get a position. The director says that my profile is really excellent, that I give convincing responses during the Q&A, but that my research is too far away from the thematic they have privileged for the position. The committee has said that I'm not mainstream enough. At that very moment, as I'm crying from disappointment, at that very moment, I truly realize that I have been a token in that process of recruitment. I feel like being a token in general. I feel that the institution needed to show my profile without seriously considering to invite my person for a durable stay. And the fourth and last episode, V is exposed to a series of online racist attacks and harassment by the far right wing that targets not only her professional integrity, but also her specific gendered, racialized identity. She interpolates the direction of her institution and asks for support and action, but does not receive any response. Nobody really acknowledged the violence that happened to me. All my claims seem to hit a wall. They want me to be present, to figure, even to represent them, but not to really be there. Be present, but do not do you. Do not speak for yourself. So we can say that some odd things happen with V's voice and body throughout this story. And I want to begin naming and specifying the workings of those odd things. I want us to deepen our listening to this story by putting this story in dialogue with other Black feminist voices. So the following 2 steps of my argument read this story with a diasporic Black feminist analytics of power. And as I said earlier, such an analytics of power pays attention to conjugated operations of oppressions, to what the feminist thinker Saidiya Hartman calls the, I quote her, concerted processes of racialization, accumulation, engenderment, domination, and sexual subjugation. Processes that were elaborated during colonialism and slavery and still persist in today's afterlife of those histories of violence. I thus propose to situate the story of V, the Black woman on the poster, within the colonial history of 2 sets of gendered and racialized operation of power. Bodily dispossession and spectacularization on the one hand, and voice distortion and containment on the other. All right, so I come to the first set of operations that I call dispossession and spectacularization. So Black feminist accounts converge in showing how during colonialism, operations of domination, manifold operations of domination serve to maintain Black women in material and symbolic conditions of being non-humans or not quite humans. Dispossession in that context refers to the manifold practices of violence, discipline, and terror, to the legal and scientific discourses that continuously marked subjects into racialized gender difference and that exploited their productive and reproductive labor. And dispossession was sustained by logics of spectacularization. For the context of slavery and its aftermath in the Americas, Saidiya Hartman has well shown how various scenes of what she calls innocent pleasures, such as the showcasing and dancing enslaved people, or such as minstrel shows, functioned as form of diversion and secured a relation of bondage and possession. In the context of Western Europe, the legitimation and exploitation of the exploitation of non-white subjects' life and labor were sustained by what Jovita dos Santos Pinto calls the sexotic spectacle of the other, the sexotic spectacle of the other. One of the most famous examples of such a spectacle is the story of Saartjie Baartman, the so-called Hottentot Venus. And her story has been accounted by many, but here I follow the edited volume by Deborah Willis, where she explains how the body of Saartjie Baartman, including her dead body parts that were conserved in formalin by the French anatomist Cuvier at the beginning of the 19th century, how her body, her living body and her dead body was transformed into a spectacle of human inferiority and gendered, racial, and sexual abnormality, and how it was actually circulating in different and exhibited in different cities in Europe. In the context of Switzerland, a Manuak Pakpo is one of the only known name and fragmented story amongst the many nameless and unknown Africans who were staged in human zoos. Including, I mean, there were a lot of human zoos in different cities in Switzerland. And we don't have the name of the people who were exhibited in these zoos throughout the end of the 19th century until the mid-20th century, but Amanua Pakpo is one of the names that that historians have found. So Baartman's and Pakpo's embodied stories exemplify the ways the spectacles of race have constituted a modern racializing and sexualizing eye, a gaze. So if we come back to this story, this story, the story of the Black woman on the poster, it takes place in a Western European context where colonialism and racism have been officially condemned by the supranational community, and where discourses, policies, and measures of diversity have been implemented in most academic contexts. Formerly objects of science, Black and brown people have acquired status, allowing them to no longer remain strictly objects and become subjects of knowledge. However, as claimed by Black feminist scholars, racialized and gendered forms of power have not ceased to operate after decolonization and the legal dismantling of racial and colonial modes of governing. And I want to demonstrate with the following close reading of these accounts how tokenizing practices and techniques benefit from past history and come to reconfigure and renew operations of dispossession and spectacularization. So let me come back to this story, to the story of the Black woman on the poster. Techniques of visual and audiovisual representations are investing this body in order to produce a pleasant image of her, a smiling face. So this body is used to produce what Sarah Ahmed defines as the, I quote her, marketing appeal of diversity. She writes, "This appeal allows the university to sell itself by presenting itself as a happy place, a place where differences are celebrated, welcomed, and enjoyed. diversity becomes a form of organizational pride. Not only does this rebranding of the university as being diverse work to conceal racism, but it also works to reimagine the university as being anti-racist, end of the quote. So this image is actually over-invested because she embodies this appeal of diversity, the appeal of difference. So she is asked to be in all the fields because the university needs her body, needs her image to show that it's actually a university that is committed to the equality and diversity. But from the perspective of V, the institutional overinvestment in her image follows the logics of dispossession and spectacularization. It resonates with past, but also present, visual and affective consumptions of racialized gendered bodies. It resonates with the incessant circulation and renewal of stereotypical images of Blackness in advertisement, entertainment, and culture. Through such resonances, V's body becomes spectacular, very present, and giant, as she describes. These images stick her image, her body image, to her institution. The institution is invested in showing her profile. Her unbodied institutional existence, however, has no guarantee to sticking around. It has no guarantee to stay durably, as she says. So becoming a token means facing the possibility of remaining a fixed and very recognizable, smiling, advertising face of an institution, while at the same time being told that one is not mainstream enough and thus out of place. Under colonization, colonized subjects were represented as always smiling and grateful for the colonial products advertised in the metropole. Those innocent images functioned as diversion, the aim at concealing the violent extraction of colonized bodies and territories. In the contemporary context of neoliberal higher education institutions, the smiling faces and happy slogans of racialized and gendered minorities are used to conceal persistent inequalities and epistemic violence. The token, I suggest, is the contemporary neoliberal echo of past modes of racial and gender domination through diversion. Smiling faces of racial and gendered minorities conceal persistent inequalities. They produce the look of inclusion without inclusion. They produce a form of Black visibility within higher education that is unsustainable for those whose images are used and overused. Okay, so here I have talked about how we can understand tokenizing as a set of processes that are investing the bodies of minorities in higher education and how that comes from the history of colonialism. But we have to focus also on the voice of what happened with the voice of those same subjects whose bodies are tokenized. And here we can recall that in V's story, something happens with her body, but also something happened with her voice. Her voice is used to deliver the message of how wonderful her institution is. But on the other hand, her institution says you are not mainstream enough. Do not speak for yourself. So here I want to describe a second set of operations. So this is the third step of my argument, arguing that tokenizing operates through voice distortion and containment. And here I rely again and always on Black feminism, but also on post-colonial critique and scholars who have provided us with an expanded critique of Western modern knowledge production. And they have shown that and demonstrated the manifold mechanisms through which the voices of enslaved and colonized subjects and their descendants have been unauthorized, namely silenced, forgotten, or neglected. Saidia R. Hartman, for instance, insists on the notion of archival power or appropriation, and she analyzes the way Black voices have been distorted in the archives as they have come to us through the mediation of slave owners and their descendants. Patricia Hill Collins calls the term suppression, the suppression of Black women's intellectual work, to critique the constant denial and neglect of Black women's intellectual labor. And I propose actually to use the notions of distortion and containment to synthesize the many colonial and racist practices, devices, techniques, and discourses that continuously invested, subjugated subjects' means of expression and communication in order to control them and to bar them from the realm of authorized, liberal, and rational subjects of knowledge. One telling example of a voice distorting and containing device can be found in the book by Grada Quilomba, Plantation Memories, where she recalls the figure and portrait of Escravia Anastasia, the slave Anastasia, in colonial Brazil, who was forced to wear a face mask. I'm trying to see if I'm good with time, but I actually didn't check. So maybe I'm not gonna read the whole story of Escrava Anastasia. What I find very interesting in that story, so she was an enslaved person in colonial Brazil. We don't know her original name, so Anastasia was a name that was given to her, but there are a series of representation of visual representation of her, where she actually wears a face mask. And I didn't want to show this image because I think it's very violent. But what I find very interesting in this story and what Quilomba is referring to is that the face mask was a device of that Quilomba names the mask of speechlessness. And she explained that it was an instrument that used to prevent the enslaved from eating the products of the plantations while they were working, but also a device that functioned to implement a sense of speechlessness and fear. So the mask functioned as an extreme device of voice distortion and containment. When put in and on the mouth, it literally muted the enslaved subject. Moreover, if not literally enforced in and on the mouth, it imprinted a sense of fear. It functioned as an instrument of terror that aimed at containing the enslaved from political activism and resistance. The mask was also securing the ears of the masters, allowing them to avoid listening to the uncomfortable truth voices voiced by the enslaved, allowing them to keep those truths quiet at distance. So the question here is how does the mask, amongst other similar colonial practices and technologies of muting, haunts the containment and distortion of Black women's voices in today's higher education? And here again, I come back to V's story. And we can see that her voice in that story emerges under two modalities. On the one hand, her voice appears as happy. In the student service campaign and the bachelor promotional clips, it translates into smiling, walking with confidence, and the explanation of how wonderful her institution is. On the other hand, V's voice struggles to be heard. When it is not happy, V's voice seems to evaporate. The expression of her interrogation about her figuration in a clip alongside professors encounters the insistence of her superior. Her job talk is deemed convincing, but too far away from the mainstream. So when V uses her voice to denounce a violent episode of racism, she hits walls. V's distinctive voice, the voice that mediates her experiences and knowledge in her own terms, does not stick to the ears of those who have the power of institutional action and decision. So here I want to suggest that the happy voice is the neoliberal echo of the face mask. The happy voice, or what Patricia Hill Collins calls the comfortable discourse, masks the critical voice. The happy voices that populate the visual and sonic landscapes of today's institution and public spaces are the perverse devices that contain and distort the distinctive and critical voices of Black women and other racially minoritized subjects. Contemporary processes of tokenizing, I want to suggest, capitalize on past and present histories of distortion and containment. The association of intellectual work with a territory that is too far away or not mainstream enough resonates with past and ongoing disqualification and externalizing of the knowledge cultivated by subjects marked by racialized and gendered difference. They secure the hegemonic ears that are most often the ears of cis straight white male who are at the top in higher education institutions. These processes hinder Black subjects' distinctive voices to reach ears and provoke concerned responses. In sum, the happy voices produce and reproduce the sound of inclusion. Without real inclusion, they thus contribute to a form of Black visibility that tends to become inaudible. All right, so I come to the last part, brief part of my talk. I have argued that tokenizing works through bodily dispossession and spectacularization, and through voice distortion and containment, and that those sets of operation, those operations of power, have to be reinscribed in the long history of colonialism and slavery in order to really make sense of how they operate and where they come from. And in conclusion, I want to emphasize that those operations interact, so those two sets of operation interact and mutually reinforce each other. They produce a chain of tokenizing ears and eyes. Eyes that invest in the spectacles of smiling Black women tend to orient ears towards only hearing comfortably packaged discourses, and they tend to disorient those ears from critical, disruptive discourses. Ears invested in comfortable token voices reinforce in turn eyes, a gaze oriented to see Black women as smiling, marketable subjects, and disorient the same eyes from seeing Black women real presence. V says, they want me to be present, even to represent them, but not really be there. How can one really be there if one is continuously exposed to ears and eyes that privilege one's token bodies and one's token voice? Tokenizing, moreover, inquires that Black academics or other racially minoritized academics have to produce a work surplus, and I will end with that. In addition to being pressured to fit in, scholars of color must also feed the constant visual and affective production of academia as a happy, diverse place. In addition to comply with norms of success and productivity, scholars of color must develop skills of code switching and voice self-management if they want to persist in their institution. Mabula Soumaoro defines such a work surplus as the burden of race, what she calls in French, la charge raciale. She writes about this constant burden that weighs on the shoulders of people that are unfavorably racialized. And the burden refers to the constant task of explaining when a violent racist situation occurs, while at the same time making sure that the comfort of the dominating group is not too troubled is maintained. So if we circle back to the aim of the week to think about visibility as a certain form of visibility as potentially excluding, I wish that I have shown with this focus that I had on tokenism, tokenizing, that there are forms of visibility that actually reproduce exclusion, or what I call in unsustainable inclusion, that reproduce inequalities within institutions. And I also wish to have shown that a Black feminist framework offers us key resources to understand those processes of power taking place within higher education by reinscribing them in a long history of colonialism and slavery. And I want to conclude by suggesting that Black feminism or Black feminist resources are key for envisioning the this turn from unsustainability towards thriving. And here I really like the definition by Hortense Pillars. She says that thriving is discovering one's marvels of inventiveness. I think that this defines intellectual work very beautifully. And how can we discover the marvels of our inventiveness? I think such marvels cannot emerge and thrive within higher education institutions if the latter do not intensively seek to dismantle their modes of seeing and hearing Black women and racially minoritized subjects. To put it in other words, academia's vibrancy and ability to sustainably host thinkers and innovators marked by difference heavily depends on the decolonization of its hegemonic eyes and ears. And I thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't take too much time, and looking forward to your questions.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. That was phenomenal. That was powerful. I'm going to be reflecting on the notes taken for a long time. With that said, I would like to turn it over to the audience to see if we have any questions or comments.
Should I stop the sharing, or do we?
Sure, for now you can go ahead and stop the sharing.
Let's do that.
And since we are on Zoom, if anyone would like to ask through audio means, you can do so, or you can go ahead and type your question in the chat and I will address it as well.
We do have a first question, yeah? And two even now.
So I see in the chat, Nicole Remy's comment and question for you, Dr. Michelle. The look of inclusion without inclusion is clearly problematic. I worked at a STEM program for kids where there were almost no girls. We started showing the few girls on the pictures, in parentheses, so comparable to your example of the Black woman on the poster, because we wanted to attract more girls. Do you know a better way, so a way without tokenizing?
Should I answer it directly or take many questions? How do we proceed?
Go ahead, you can answer that directly.
Yeah. All right, I always need, after a talk, I always need to kind of be back in the Q&A mode. So sorry if my first answers are a little bit confusing. Do you know a better way? I think I'm not saying here, because I think I really want to make sure that people understand that I'm not against representation, and I think that representation matters. And many of my students have told me that it was so important for them to actually have a Black woman as a professor, that just seeing me was already giving them strength to pursue. So I really want to make sure that we understand that representation matters. The problem is that this representation, this politics of external representation, the way we show otherness towards the exterior, has to be backed up with a very thorough set of practices and action at the interior of the institution. Those are things that people cannot see. So a better way, there is not one better way, because I ended my talk by saying that we need to decolonize the ears and the eyes of higher education institutions. And I think the same goes also for gender, like the question of sexism and gender. So it has to start with it's a deep unlearning, a deep actually dismantling of the way those institutions have, of the history of those institutions. One first thing is to look at the history of those institutions. There is no way, for instance, a university will understand the problematic of tokenizing without having a specific research about what were the specific form of objectifying that took place throughout the history of their institution. For instance, in the University of Geneva, we had like body remains that were taken during the colonial time. And it's only some years ago that the university started to think, what do we do with these body remains? So maybe it's also like putting an eye on the institution has to actually watch herself. This is a start of the answering, because it's a huge task. And of course, I think we need more Black feminism in general everywhere. Preaching for my church, but I'm very convinced that Black feminism is a super powerful framework to understand the complexity of power and the intersections of different power relations. I hope that begins to answer.
Thank you very much. We also have another question. Did you also do research on good, in parentheses, or better practices? And I'm assuming that's from the academic perspective.
Yes. I think I'm actually skeptical with the notion good practices and better practices, because I think it tends to give us like a formula, a simple formula of what we have to do. Okay, we were wrong. What should we do in order not to be wrong? And my approach is very more materialist, very more like encompassing. It's like we all inherit of a violent history, and this history continues to live through the institutions, through academia. And my practice is actually, so I can actually talk about my practice. I will also talk about it just afterwards. But I think that alternative pedagogies and other ways of kind of thinking about what counts as knowledge is a good start. How come that when I come to my class and I'm teaching to master students course, an MA course about critical theories of race and post-coloniality, and this is one of the only course in my university about these topics. And when I ask my students if they know about the history of the Haitian Revolution, which is in the world history one of the most well-achieved revolution in terms of freedom, because it's like formerly enslaved people who declared that everybody was equal, including Black people. So how come that all my students, like maybe 10% of my students know about this revolution, and when I ask them if they know about the French Revolution, they all start to laugh. They are like, yeah, of course we know about it, and they laugh. So I think here we see the gap. So it's not about good or better practice, it's about really reflecting on whose knowledge and whose traditions of knowledge are centered within academia. And it's not just about the traditions, but it's also about the moods of knowing. How do we know? For instance, I asked my students to do audio essays instead of written essays, and that will center other abilities. That will also maybe give more chance to students who suffer with dyslexia and with certain form of inabilities, because suddenly the orality has been centered, and this is related to other forms of knowledge. Again, starting to answer.
I want to highlight what you said about the Haitian Revolution and quickly just bring up a story that I experienced this summer. So I went to Liverpool, and they have a slavery museum in Liverpool because of its base in the UK for slavery. There's a timeline that goes from the 1500s to current day, and it has things like apartheid in South Africa, even talking about some incidents that occurred in Brazil and of course the US. There's 1 year that is completely omitted, which is 1804. There's no mention of the Haitian Revolution there. So when you talk about that knowledge, it's crazy.
It's crazy that, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's crazy that even in the context of an exhibition about slavery and about that history, because for me, Black feminism is a very long, century-long tradition of critical thought that is rooted in practices of resistance, ranging from micro practices, domestic practices, to revolutionary events. And I think we would all benefit from the knowledge of those practices. The more we know about this history of resistance, the more we can think about a better, more inclusive, more equal collectivities and way of being together. And maybe also I want to add to complete my answer to the question about the good or better practices. I think it's very important to think about where the money goes. Who accumulates money? Because about the history that I called about V is like she's very hyper visible. So her body has a lot of values, but the resources and the financial resources do not go to her, and she doesn't have like she remains in a precarious position in academia. And in that book, there are actually statistics. I'm not so much into statistics, I'm more into experiences and lived experiences, but there are statistics that show that there is a double glass ceiling in academia and other institutions when it comes to Black women and other women of color, and in general racially minoritized subjects, that they do not stay. And it's not because they're not brilliant, it's not because they're not innovative, it's because of these kind of processes. This burden of race that I talked about, this is exhausting. And it's also, and so the resources, I think a good practice would be to really like look at the budget of an institution, of your laboratory, and be like, okay, what budget actually do we devote to not only issues of diversity and equality? It's not about doing one event, it's about subjects who have been historically excluded from this laboratory. And here I dare to talk about reparation. If those subject ancestors had human remains that were stolen or objects that were stolen, and they inherit from this history of violence and stealing, maybe there is a way of repairing that can happen. And I think money here is a really important issue.
That talk of reparations is extremely important, and I wish we had more time to go into it today. With the time that we have left, I would like to turn it back over to you as we conclude the Q&A, just to show and talk about some of the upcoming events that you have.
Yeah, okay. I just saw a very interesting questions about quotas, but yeah,
I know. I wish we could get into it.
Yeah, I invite everybody to maybe also reach out. I'm open. I mean, maybe now it's the start of the term, but I'm open to continuing these exchanges. All right, so let me share again the screen. Yeah, I just wanted to share some events that actually really relate to the research I have been presenting. So if maybe you happen to be in Brussels next week, I'm co-chairing a panel with Jovita dos Santos Pinto. I think she has talked here in St. Gallen last year or maybe 2 years ago. And we are interested in what we call Black feminist archiving and the digital. And this is also maybe an answer towards the question of best practices and good practices, because a lot of what I have talked about also happens in the digital realms, in the websites of the universities, not just in the videos. So I think the digital is a very crucial site. So here we will co-chair a panel. Then, as I said, I work more and more as a cultural worker, and I took part to the co-writing of theater creation about the coloniality of urban spaces and the Black experience in Europe. This will be in the Théâtre du Grutli in Geneva, if you happen to be in Geneva at some point, but also it will tour, so it will be in Lausanne, La Chaux-de-Fonds, Paris, so also check that out. And finally, and I already hinted toward that, I did radio shows, podcasts with my students instead of written essays, and I partnered with a public radio, and you can listen to their audio essays in French about, most of all are about different critical Black thinkers and thematics. Here I go.
Great. Thank you
Awesome.
very much, Noemi. Thank you very much, Christian. Our time is up, people.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
This went so quickly.
Yeah, it gets away very, very fast. Yes. And tomorrow it continues. Tomorrow we have the last 2 online sessions about wage transparency, and later about intelligence measuring and using intelligence as something to exclude or include, perhaps, I don't know. That's what we're gonna see next week, tomorrow. With that said, thank you very, very much. Thank you for being around and spreading the word, the good word.
Thank you so
Cool.
much. I'm just putting my email here because I think that some, especially some scholars of color and Black women wanted to continue the conversation. So please reach out.
Great. With that said, time to say goodbye. Bye-bye, people. See you tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Lohn Transparenz, es wird auf Deutsch sein. Bye-bye.
Bye.